All right, welcome back to the Classical Republican. This is part three of my interview with Lars Doucet, and we are talking about the land value tax. Okay, so if you have a lot of public land, does that lessen the impact of the LVT?
Yeah. So if you have a lot of public land, you have some options you can do with it. So from a pure economic perspective, if all you want to do is capture land rents, if the government already owns the land, it can just lease it out, right? And I mean, leasing out land can work better than you expect. The Empire State Building was built on leased land, actually. Privately leased, I think, but still, there's no reason the government couldn't do the same. And governments typically don't often know that their land is necessarily worth a lot, and if they were to do this more often, they would realize it. So if the government owns a lot of land, it out to people, and something like a victory auction or whatever to do price discovery, and that would approximate a land value tax. And there's an advantage to it in that it skips the assessment process, right? Because whatever a lessee is willing to pay, is the market rent of the land. There you go. You don't need to have an assessment. And so there's some advantage there. Is that, if the government owns a lot of land, then it can get kind of a central planning vibe and start to do that sort of thing. So you would want to make sure that the lessee has pretty free reign to build the stuff on the properties and do things like that. There is a bit of a kind of movement called starter cities, kind of an offshoot of the charter cities movement, to kind of create little private governments, so to speak, that basically buy up a lot of land in an area and basically build on kind of a Georgism model, where you basically have a little private government that leases out all the land, all of its citizens, and if you live in that area, you're also a de facto shareholder of this corporation that owns all the land. And that gets you kind of back to distributism in a way, where everyone is kind of an owner, in this kind of weird little land cooperative sort of deal. There's been some attempts at this in the past, but there's some more sophisticated plans of getting it online now. And I think, the system can certainly work. It's just a different approach to capturing land. Here's a good example of this through a classic government method, and that's what's called land value capture, specifically for transit. We know through the Henry George theorem by Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz that public spending on public goods and public infrastructure, public improvements gets soaked into land values. So one of the reasons we can't build anything in America, how can China and Japan and all that build all these bullet trains? Can't. Well, one of the reasons is because land policy here is because in Asia they build public transit through various means. They have ways of capturing the uplift in land value that comes when you build transit through an area. All that land value goes up. And so either the government will already own that land and then lease it out to shops, whatever, or they will have some tax on the increase in land values served after you put in transit. And then public infrastructure just pays for itself automatically. Great, right? Because otherwise, the alternative is we go out there, we buy all this land, speculators see that infrastructure is coming in, so they buy up all the land ahead of time just to hold it out of use and extract money from the government. And then the government comes in, builds a huge bajillion-dollar boondoggle, financed usually with bonds, which is debt, which is a tax, of course, on everybody's, basically leads to inflation, right? And then the cities kind of go broke and go bankrupt, and we have this crappy infrastructure, as opposed to the infrastructure makes the surrounding land more valuable. The government's able to capture the value provided, reinvest it in the infrastructure, make the infrastructure even better. They don't even need to capture all the value, just enough of it, right? And we see this very successfully out in Asian countries. And so that is how I think public ownership of land, or at least public capture of land value, should be used to fund infrastructure projects.
Very interesting. Throughout history, there have been some great classical republics that have come about through the imposition of greater equality through the distribution of land. You have examples like Sparta. We don't really understand how the Lycurgan reforms really got started. But they ended up with, basically this land distribution to all the warriors so they could concentrate on their combat training. You have situations like in the early Republic of Rome, where they conquered territory and then distributed land to the citizens. You have a lot of good classical Republican political theory comes out of the English Civil War, because you had all this land that was, if you were on the wrong side, you could uh, give that to your people who are poor, landless, and give them a leg up, I guess you could say. But in the United States, we had, of course, this was based on Native American genocide, but that we were able to, the government was able to give land to citizens very cheap, or sometimes free if you were able to improve it, through things like the Homestead Act or other similar legislation throughout our history. But in the 1890s, you have Frederick Jackson Turner, who comes up with the term the closing of the American frontier. What's a Georgist analysis of the closing of the frontier? And I believe in your book you talk about some other closing of American frontiers. Can you talk about that too, please?
Yeah, so let me talk about this. So land reform is basically when you basically take land out of the hands of the few and give it to the many. And this can happen well or it can happen badly. A good example would be Pol Pot or Mao, who basically have a murder landlords philosophy, and I'm definitely not in favor of that. But you have Georgist reformers like Wolf Latitude in Taiwan and places like that, and then influence in Japan and Korea, not necessarily. Ladijinsky, I think, was specifically in Taiwan. I that was doing things in some of those other countries, but Taiwan had this very effective land reform program called A Land of the Tiller, which is where they basically Japanese imperialist Japanese were the landowners, but then also like a couple of just very small number of like Taiwanese families also like between them and the colonial Japanese like owned most of the land. I think I'm getting my history right. Point is, it was very concentrated in a small number of hands, and the reform was basically whatever farmer is currently working this small field, now, right? And now because they own it, they have an incentive to improve it, right? And because instead of just an absentee landlord charging them rent. And this is basically, there's this book called How Asia Works that talks about most of the Asian tigers, Taiwan and Korea, a lot of these like places in China that have like I'm not China, Asia, sorry, that have really seen this big reform. They all start with land reform, right? And you see land reform, this classic cyclical cycle throughout history. The Bible has all these like portions where they talk about, like the Jubilee and like the Redeemer. There's all this like land reform in the Bible too. And it's because society becomes unsustainable when land is concentrated and it needs to reform. George's critique of land reform is not that bad. He thinks it's good, but it inevitably just cyclically gets tied up again in a couple of small number of hands. So like, let's talk about the frontier. America really has not had land reform, right? And America was kind of land reform for European refugees of the land list, right? A bunch of Norwegian peasants came over to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and stuff. You go and you read Asbjørnsen and Moe, the kind where you get like the Billy Goat's Gruff fairy tales and stuff. You will see fairy tales and something like this. And then the Ash Lad slew the evil land-owning troll and stole all his gold and silver, with which he was able to pay back most of his debts. Like, it's just amazing how much like landowners are the villains in these like turn of the century fairy tales, because like that was the struggle. People needed land, they wanted land, they couldn't have it locked up in Europe for and so in America we had this frontier, we had this big great swath of free land. You could just go and you could just take it. It's very convenient that there were people there that got forced out through plague and war and conquest and genocide, essentially. And so they were on the losing end of that. But for everyone who wasn't, it was this huge opportunity. You could just go and you could homestead. And so the problem with America is that America to this day has the mindset of a frontier nation. But the problem is America no longer has a frontier. We're a frontier nation without a frontier. First frontier was West Virginia, and that ended, around 1890 when like the frontier essentially closed. Like all the land was now taken, right? And so there was a second opening of the frontier, and this is what happened through the entire 20th century. And it was the automobile, right? I talked about this before. Sprawl was the second frontier because the issue is that you want to be close to the economic center. Whether it's the gold rush or a plum job in New York, you want to be close to the economic center. It's valuable to be there. You can be very productive there in a way you can't be in the middle of the desert. And the problem is over time, that value, that extra productivity gets priced in. This is why the rent is too high, is that all the productivity of being in an economic center is priced into your rent, into the price of land. And so with the automobile, with the Western frontier, when land was mostly of agricultural use, it's like, well, you can just go and get land no one's claimed, and the value hasn't been priced in yet. You don't need to pay rent to anyone to live there. So you just go and you just take that land, and now you can just homestead yourself. Later, when productivity of land moved to urban centers, then it was like, okay, well, you live in the urban center in a crowded tenement home trying to get a good factory job because there's only so far you can walk to work. Oh, we invent the automobile. You can now live miles away from work and commute in and still have access to a good job. And it took decades, like basically the whole century, to build out that entire new frontier of interior land that wasn't really valuable before because it wasn't right next to a city center, that was now, quote unquote, next to a city center because you could travel so much faster, right? And unfortunately, that frontier has now essentially closed. Now we're still building suburbs, but it's all priced in now. The value of living, so close to the city it's like that you're paying for whatever proximity you can get through the inflated value of house prices, because that's now basically been fully captured. And this is the reason now conflicts between boomers, millennials, and others, right? The boomers say, well, why don't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work hard? I did. Why can't you? College cost a nickel when I was, right? Well, because it's priced in now. The frontier is closed. You were in the great second American frontier, and we're not lucky enough to experience that. And so we're now like those peasants in Europe who are like, all the land is owned, I have to pay to, my landlord everything I make in wage. And so waiting for a new frontier to open, and there's not a new frontier to open. Work from home is not going to do it. That's pretty much already over, and it's already fully priced in. And the only option is to share the land. And that is the story of the American frontier in land ownership. We could forcefully redistribute all the land. I think that's incredibly, unpopular. And even if we did, like, you only get like one chance a century to really pull that off. It usually takes a revolution. And then there's a chance that the land just goes to politically connected cronies in Zimbabwe. Like Mugabe had a rival. I forget what his name was. It was it Joshua Nkomo? I can't remember. But Mugabe had a rival who was a Georgist who wanted to do Georgist distribution instead of murder the landlords and give it out to politically connected cronies. And so we've seen what can happen when land distribution goes wrong in Zimbabwe. And instead of having a more equitable future that had the racial tensions that Zimbabwe has to, and the poverty and the famine and the horror, And so, and then even if you do the land redistribution 50, 60 years later, you're right back where you started. And so that's why we believe that land value tax is the way to get.
Very interesting. You hear a lot about reparations for the descendants of slaves today. I think Georgists would have liked the ideas that the radical Republicans were putting forward during and after the Civil War and Reconstruction, but never came to fruition of giving them, 40 acres and mule or some form of compensations or some form of the means of production. But if they today we talk about the giving like a cash some sort of cash award to descendants of former slaves. Do you think it's still possible to connect reparations to land, and if that would that be good in the Georgist view?
I mean, reparations is a thorny subject because now you've got a lot of like African immigrants who aren't descended from African American slaves, and like who you're tracing back everyone's genealogy and stuff. But let's just assume for the sake of argument you can solve that problem, right? What we should have done is give everyone 40 acres and a mule. Like, not only would that have been just, but we would be so much better economically if we had that. The productivity that African American society would have unlocked, to the investment, like America would be a much richer country today. It would not have just been a handout to an undeserving class, right? Like, just the massive lost productivity in America, just lost because of that, is unfathomable. On top of so assuming you can sort out everyone's genealogy, like figure that out. Well, really, like, how are you going to fund it, right? Like higher income taxes, higher sales taxes. Like, land value tax is basically the only thing that can give you enough money to do like a program like that. But I think the other thing more important to like consider when you think about reparations is we didn't miss one opportunity with regards to justice to the African American community. We missed two. And the second one was redlining, right? Housing, like basically Black people in America and Native Americans have frankly been screwed by being consistently denied access to land. And this is how they have been screwed historically and continue to be screwed. First, by basically being excluded from the frontier because basically, the Indians were on the frontier and then taken from it, and then Blacks were mostly excluded from that. And then redlining explicitly zoned them out of all the most desirable neighborhoods. That second frontier of sprawl, of suburban sprawl, they were specifically excluded from redlining. If you go and you read Hill and Gray's excellent work, Arbitrary Lines on Zoning, it's an excellent book to read. You see how the history of zoning is explicitly racist. And I don't mean it in this like critical race theory, like BS, everything I don't like is racist kind of racist way that people on Twitter like to say. Like working hard and being punctual is white supremacy culture, like that kind of BS. I mean, like, the founders of zoning were like, we're doing this to keep Black people out of white people's neighborhoods. That's the reason, like, just explicitly. And so even before we get to talk about reparations, we could stop screwing them over as a zero step. Like, whether or not we ever get to reparations, we could at least stop excluding them through zoning, and then just share out land value tax to everyone. Yeah, and you can debate about whether this would be as, whether this would be as like just as deliberately targeting them specifically. But if we were to just do those things, we would remove the boot from their neck, and those neighborhoods would be just like we would solve so many problems that are downstream of consistently excluding them from land and from desirable housing. Like, if you look at if you map like riots in cities, race riots that happen, there's this almost perfect overlap with historically redlined districts. Like, we did this to ourselves. We created this problem ourselves, so we should stop doing this to ourselves, right? Even if you didn't care an ounce about racial justice, which you should, but even if you didn't care an ounce, like, it's just bad society overall, and then I think if you actually do want to pull the trigger and do reparations, like, land value tax is basically the only way you're ever going to be able to afford it.
Wow, it's fascinating. What do George's now? I just read the I just finished the Progress and Poverty by Henry George, and I haven't really had much time to digest it all completely. But he does talk about inheritance, and I don't know, maybe I didn't I haven't really thought about it enough yet. But what is really the policy on inheritance for George's?
I'm not super read up on that particular topic exactly. Like, the main thing George is really concerned about is, like, I mean, George goes on and says, like, he's okay with people inheriting land as long as we're doing LVP, right? And then there's the issue of like other kinds of inheritances and stuff. The general thrust of Georgism is Georgism doesn't really care about punishing capital. In fact, it doesn't want to. It thinks capital is justly rewarded for its contribution, so long as separate land from capital and really deal with land. People shouldn't be able to gatekeep access to the earth and to the natural resources, to just the bounties of God that no man has created. I think there's an argument that actually flows from that like inheritance is like one of those undeserved assets. But Georgism is really more concerned with, at least in my interpretation, the non-produced aspect rather than the non-deserved aspect. You know what I mean? Like that's more about it. It's not trying to decide, it's like, well, you deserve this, you deserve that. It's more like, you didn't make it. Like, you're just taking the earth and charging me to access it because you got there first. And you only hold title because someone else held title to it, and someone sold it to them, and sold it to them who killed an Indian to take it, right? And so I'm sure someone has written like the canonical, like, George's theory about inheritance. I don't really have a good answer to it. I think, my children can work for a living like everybody else. I wouldn't be particularly put out by an inheritance tax. I know some people particularly put out by it. I don't really care, as long as we get the land value tax. Like, if the political bargain was you can have a land value tax as long as you don't touch inheritance, I'm like, your terms are acceptable. But like, if someone was like, if it was the opposite, like, only have land value tax, but we also have inheritance tax, I'll be like, your terms are acceptable. That's just.
All right. Thank you. So Henry George was really in favor of free trade, from what I understand. If we are in a post-liberal order, and free trade is going to be on decline for the next for the foreseeable generations, what would could Georgism be as impactful if tariffs are coming up and we don't have free trade like we used to?
Yeah, I mean, you do the best you can, right? George was very much against tariffs. Keep in mind that in George's time, tariffs were the main way the government made income. So tariffs weren't just necessarily like an act of policy or like a strategic decision. They were like, we need money, so we're going to basically screw with productivity because we need money. And he's like, there's a much better way to do that without monkeying with the economy. So nowadays it's like, okay, I can see the strategic reason why not have free trade with China, because maybe we'll be at war soon and we don't want to basically sell them the weapons to blow it up with later, and all of those concerns. And so like, I get that. But generally speaking, try to keep tariffs as low as you can. Try to have as much free trade as you can, so long as you get these Georgian policies that actually make free trade work, because without them, you can have all these horrible distortions. So you just do the best you
can. Okay. So you've already talked about, and this will be my last question, what would Georges think about UBI, Universal Basic Income? And you've already talked about the citizens' dividend. I know some people kind of talk about that as a form of UBI. What are your general thoughts on UBI?
Yeah, so the citizens' dividend, depending on how you look at it, is either equivalent to UBI or not actually equivalent. And so what really makes a citizens' dividend a dividend is like, it's in the name, it's a dividend, right? It's your share of America's prosperity that nobody, that's basically that all of us are equally entitled to, right? You know what I mean? And that's kind of the difference from UBI. UBI is kind of pitched as, we need to do this to like deal with poverty and stuff, and that rankles people because it feels like undeserved. Whereas the citizens' dividend is a little more grounded in like, nobody deserves to basically collect rent for gatekeeping the earth. So, but that rent accumulates. So who should get it? Well, everybody, right? And what's funny is like, it's actually red states that kind of lead the way with the closest things to this, like Alaska, the Permanent Wealth Fund. They have a system that's very similar to Norway's petroleum system, and it's just like, hey, this is Alaska's oil. It belongs to the Alaskan people. We hire some people to go get it for us, and we pay them a reasonable amount, but then it's our oil. So here's your share of Alaska's bounty that God has given Alaska, right? And that seems very just and very reasonable. And it can achieve a lot of benefits as UBI, but I think the moral pitch for it is very different. And then additionally, like, the Georges perspective is that land value tax is worth doing, even if you throw every penny of the funds raised from it into the sea. Like, it's important to do to reduce speculation on all these evils that happen to our society if land rent is privately collected. But now that you've done it, you get all this benefit. And then I think the pitch is for people who are like skeptical that it's going to lead to government, it's like basically there's two approaches. Like the left approach, like we'll use this for all the public spending. And the right approach is it's like, okay, well, to keep it out of the hands of the government, we just share it out. And then in practice, it's going to depend on whether your locality is like more left or right leaning. Probably it's like split down the middle. Here, the public spending we're already doing, instead of doing it with these inefficient taxes, we'll use LVT for it. And anything that's left over, citizens dividend. So that, the government doesn't get any big ideas of going on weird, bizarre, useless adventures now that has all this extra money. Like just return it to the people. It's like you deserve it as your of being one of the people who's created the collective economic value of America.
Wow. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. Those are all the questions I have right now. Is there anything else you want to share with the viewers? Definitely buy your book. Land is a big deal.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Larsius Prime, and have a lot of I serialized the article, the book as a series of articles on gameofrent.com, and I have some other Georgist writing there. And there's links to like a Georgist Discord and other things like that if you want to like get involved with other people who've written a lot of good stuff. We have a Substack called the Progress and Poverty Substack, which I think is progressandpoverty.substack.com. Group blog. We write a lot of stuff there. So yeah, just shout out to those. And then the book Land is a Big Deal. You can get it at landisabigdeal.com, or just look for it on Amazon, on Audible, all the usual places.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for joining me today.
No problem.
And have a good day.